CEO's cruel mom invited her to humiliate her in his second marriage, but when she came with twins, he fell to his knees. Warm welcome to Beyond Color Stories. I'm your storyteller, James, and I truly hope you're doing well today. So tell me, what are you up to right now? And more importantly, where are you listening from? Because I really want to know you, connect with you, and cherish every one of you who's part of James's family. You're not just viewers. You're the soul of this channel, and I truly care about each one of you. And hey, if you're still not part of James's family, I gently invite you to hit that subscribe button right now and become part of this beautiful, growing, and loving community. The morning sun poured gently through the thin cream curtains of a small but warm home nestled in the quieter part of the city, illuminating a space filled not with grandeur, but with heart, laughter, and a soft kind of peace that came from surviving storms and learning how to bloom anyway. Lena stood silently in the center of her living room, her fingers curled tightly around the smooth edges of an envelope that shimmered slightly under the morning light, its golden lining glinting with cruel arrogance. The invitation bore the kind of elegant cursive that was meant to impress, but to her it felt more like a dagger wrapped in silk, because this wasn't just any invitation. It was an invitation to the wedding of Henrik Klassen, the man she had once called husband, the man who once whispered forever and then vanished without turning back. Her eyes traced the finely inked words, the date, the venue, the grand scale of it all. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a public statement, a performance meant to dazzle. But the wound wasn't just that he was getting remarried. It was that the card hadn't come from him, but from his mother, Sabrina Klassen, a woman whose heart seemed to be carved from polished stone, whose pride dripped from her words like poison. Lena didn't need to open the envelope to feel the venom inside. She already knew what it meant. It wasn't an invitation of goodwill, of reconciliation, of polite closure. No, this was a carefully aimed missile from a woman who had never accepted her, never once believed she was worthy of her precious son. Sabrina had fought against their marriage from the beginning, hiding behind polite smiles and charity galas while whispering disdain into corners, building walls around her son, manipulating him like a pawn on a board she controlled. And now, 5 years after Lena had been thrown into the shadows, left alone to raise her sons in silence, this invitation came not with hope, but with cruel precision. It was meant to humiliate her, to flaunt Henrik's new chapter in her face, to reduce her to a forgotten mistake in front of the same high society that once smiled in her face but whispered behind her back. But what Sabrina didn't know was that the woman she had tried to break had been reforged in fire. Lena was no longer the naive girl who begged to be accepted. She had become a mother, a provider, a warrior who built peace in a storm. Her gaze shifted toward the hallway as tiny laughter echoed through the home. Kai and Zane, her twin miracles, her light in the darkest nights. They had no idea what this piece of paper meant or what the name Klassen had cost their mother. At just 4 years old, they were growing into clever, joyful little boys with their father's eyes but their mother's strength. They were the reason she rose every morning, the reason she never collapsed under the weight of loneliness. She had given birth to them alone, cradled them through fevers alone, taught them their first words and steps without a helping hand. Not once had Henrik shown up, not to see their faces, not to hear their laughter. He didn't even know they existed, and it wasn't an accident. Lena had written letters, made calls, begged the universe for a chance to let him know. But every road led back to Sabrina, who made sure every plea vanished before it ever reached Henrik's heart. The same woman who now invited her, not as a guest but as entertainment, a fallen ex-wife dragged into a spectacle of wealth and status. For a long moment Lena stood motionless, the card shaking slightly in her grasp as memories clawed their way back into her mind. She remembered the day Henrich walked away, her voice raw from trying to make him hear her, his silence louder than thunder. He hadn't looked angry or broken. He had looked convinced, convinced by lies, by doubt, by a mother's manipulations that painted Lena as disloyal, gold-digging beneath them. He hadn't asked for proof, hadn't searched her eyes for truth. He had simply walked, and in that moment everything she had built with him shattered like glass. The dreams, the vows, the life they were building. They collapsed, leaving behind a woman discarded, broken, and unknowingly pregnant. She had spent nights curled into herself on a cold mattress, whispering promises to the tiny heartbeats growing inside her belly that they would never feel unloved, even if the world turned away. But that was 5 years ago. That version of her, though still living in her bones, had long since been outgrown. Today, the woman who stood holding that invitation wore quiet pride like armor. She no longer sought revenge or pity or validation. What she wanted now was clarity, for herself, for her sons, and for the story that had been hijacked by lies. Lena moved to the dresser and placed the card down gently beside a framed photo of Kai and Zane holding birthday balloons, their smiles wide, innocent, untouched by the bitterness of adults. She knew she had to go. Not for them, not for Sabrina, and certainly not for Henrik. She had to go for herself, to show the world and, most importantly, her children, that dignity does not tremble in the face of arrogance. She wouldn't lower her head. She wouldn't shrink. She would walk into that wedding not as the woman who had been cast aside, but as the woman who rose after the fall. Over the next hour, Lena moved through her home with steady determination, pulling out small dress shirts, polished shoes, tiny suspenders that Kai liked to twirl, and a navy blue bow tie that Zane had once called his superhero ribbon. The boys giggled when she told them they were going to a party, their eyes lighting up with excitement, completely unaware of the emotional battlefield ahead. Lena didn't give them the heavy truth. They didn't know this wedding involved their father. They didn't need to. Not yet. Not when their joy was so pure, so untouched by the cruelty of the world. She brushed their curls softly, humming lullabies between quiet breaths as she got them ready, her heart swelling with both love and pain. She dressed simply herself, in an elegant but modest pastel gown that kissed her smooth brown skin like sunlight, with no extravagant jewelry, no makeup painted to provoke, only grace, only truth. The mirror didn't reflect a victim. It reflected a queen in her own quiet kingdom. Outside, as the taxi arrived, Lena stood tall with one boy holding each hand, her body a shield of warmth between them and the unknown. She didn't flinch when the driver asked if she needed directions to the Klassen estate. Her lips only curled into the faintest smile. As the car moved through streets that grew wealthier with every passing block, Lena kept her eyes ahead. She didn't let memories distract her. She didn't let bitterness whisper. All that mattered now was the moment. Her heartbeat stayed calm, her spirit unshaken. This wasn't a march of shame. It was a return of truth. Sabrina had invited her to gloat, to belittle, to parade a replacement bride while burying the past. But Lena wasn't the past. She was the proof of what had been buried alive and still bloomed, and with Kai and Zane on either side, walking symbols of a love that once lived, she would enter not to stir drama, but to show that not every woman abandoned is broken. Some become fire. The road curved, and soon the gates of the Klassen estate came into view, grand and sprawling, with luxury draped across every inch, exactly as Lena remembered. Her fingers tightened slightly on her son's hands, but she didn't pause. The guards looked at her with confusion, then recognition, and then something close to discomfort. She offered them only a nod and walked through as the gates creaked open, their metal groans sounding eerily like the past opening its mouth again. The courtyard bustled with guests in silk and diamonds, laughing, toasting, unaware of the quiet storm approaching. Lena didn't rush. She walked like time owed her its breath, like the earth beneath her heels remembered who she was. People began to notice. Heads turned, whispers fluttered. But she didn't shrink, not even when she spotted Sabrina near the stairs, her lips curling into the kind of smile that was more blade than kindness. Sabrina's eyes narrowed the moment she saw the children, her mask cracking for just a second. She hadn't expected this. She had expected tears, defeat, maybe a pathetic attempt to claw at Henrik's attention. But not this. Not Lena dressed like elegance itself, and certainly not the presence of two perfect little boys with Klassen written all over their faces. It was a miscalculation, and Sabrina hated miscalculations. But Lena didn't stop to engage. She offered no greeting. She merely walked past the woman who tried to erase her and made her way into the heart of the event. The music played, the guests chatted, and still the air shifted. Some noticed, some stared, but no one could deny it. Lena had entered like a story that refused to die quietly. She hadn't come to shout or scream or beg. She came with her head held high, with the very truth Sabrina had tried to bury, walking beside her in small dress shoes. And as she stood there, in the middle of a world that once rejected her, Lena knew something deep in her bones. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of everyone else finally seeing what they tried to ignore. Her pain had taught her strength. Her loneliness had taught her how to love harder. And her sons, her beautiful, innocent boys, were not mistakes or burdens or weapons. They were light. And today she walked into darkness carrying her own son. Inside the opulent estate, the air shimmered with the scent of fresh orchids and imported perfumes, a sensory symphony of wealth curated for appearances. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne flutes, while a string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. But amidst the elegance, all eyes were beginning to drift toward the woman who had entered with poise, the one who moved like memory itself. Lena. Not because she demanded attention, but because something about her presence silenced the noise. Something about the way her boys clung lovingly to her hands, matching in polished suits, eyes curious and warm, felt more powerful than the diamonds flashing from wrists and necklines. Her walk was not rushed, yet each step was deliberate, like she was walking through a battlefield of ghosts that no longer haunted her. Sabrina had expected her to arrive crumbling, but instead, Lena stood framed by light, and with her stood truth, in twin form. Kai clutched a little paper flower he had crafted that morning and peeked around at the vast room, the chandeliers above glittering like hanging stars. Zane twirled his fingers in his bow tie and whispered to his brother with wonder, "It's so shiny here." Lena kneeled gently, adjusting their collars, her voice hushed but steady. "Be kind, be gentle, and stay beside me." They nodded, their trust in her complete, their excitement bubbling like untouched innocence. She stood again, spine unbending, heart focused not on revenge but on revelation. Her walk across the room turned heads, and not just because of her beauty, but because of the undeniable resemblance between the boys and the groom yet to appear. Whispers began to stir beneath champagne laughs. "Aren't they? Wait, are those?" But no one dared say it out loud. Not yet. Not with Sabrina watching from a corner, her forced smile turning stiffer with every glance toward the twins. Meanwhile, inside the grand dressing room upstairs, Henrik Klassen stared blankly at his reflection, his fingers stiff around the collar of his tailored white tuxedo. The stylist behind him spoke about boutonnieres and timelines, but his ears weren't listening. His mind was oddly clouded, and despite the importance of the day, his thoughts kept drifting. Something felt off. His mother had insisted everything would be perfect. She'd overseen every flower, every guest list, every detail. But he felt strangely disconnected from it all, like a man watching his own life from a distance. He turned away from the mirror and loosened the top button of his shirt, needing air. Maybe it was the echoes of the past still lingering. Maybe it was because this marriage, though organized with all the grandeur imaginable, lacked the one thing that once set his soul on fire: heart. He didn't love the woman he was about to marry. He had convinced himself he could grow into it, that maturity meant practicality, but his chest didn't beat the way it once did. Not the way it did for Lena. Back downstairs, Lena took a deep breath as she moved through the growing sea of guests. Some smiled at her cautiously, uncertain how to greet the woman whose name had vanished from society pages years ago. Others whispered behind champagne glasses, nudging each other subtly, trying to place her. But one thing was certain: no one could ignore her, especially not when Kai and Zane walked beside her like living reflections of a man they didn't know, like echoes of a love that once burned bright in the shadows. "Mommy," Zane asked softly, "will we see our daddy today?" Lena paused for half a breath, her heart clutching painfully in her chest, her eyes finding his in the innocence of her son's. She lowered herself again, brushing his curls back with trembling tenderness. "Maybe," she answered truthfully, her voice quiet but unshaken. "But no matter what happens, you both are my world, and that will never change." Zane smiled and took her hand again, completely unaware of the storm his tiny presence was about to awaken. Sabrina noticed the stir and swept toward them, her heels clicking like judgment with every step. Her designer gown trailed behind her like a shadow of her pride, and her expression was frozen somewhere between insult and disbelief. "You brought children," she said under her breath, her smile still fixed for the guest's sake. "To a wedding, Lena. How utterly tasteless of you." Lena didn't blink, her gaze calm, her voice low but unyielding. "You invited me to a celebration of truth, Sabrina. I simply brought mine." Sabrina's jaw tensed, but she didn't reply. She couldn't, not with so many watching. She turned sharply and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind the woman she once buried, now standing taller than ever. Lena guided her sons toward an empty seat at the edge of the room, letting them sit and draw quietly with the coloring books she tucked into her purse, because even queens knew how to be mothers first. Upstairs, Henrik asked for a moment alone and stepped onto the balcony to clear his head. As he looked out over the garden, his eyes swept the crowd, scanning vaguely for familiar faces. But something pulled him, an instinct, a whisper of memory, and his gaze dropped to the far edge of the room. And then he froze. He saw her, Lena, dressed in light, her posture strong, her presence undeniable. But it wasn't just her that knocked the breath from his lungs. It was the two boys seated beside her, mirror images of himself at that age. The world around him dimmed, voices muted, and time halted in its arrogant march. "No," he whispered, his heart hammering as if trying to break out of its cage. His hand gripped the balcony rail, the cold metal grounding him, but not enough to stop the flood of realization tearing through his mind. Those weren't just any boys. Those were his sons. Henrik stumbled back from the balcony and turned toward the door like a man possessed. "I need to see her," he growled at the startled wedding planner who crossed his path. "Now!" Downstairs, Lena felt something shift in the atmosphere. A string in the quartet snapped mid-note. Conversations dipped. And then, a hush, gasps, footsteps. She turned just in time to see Henrik descending the grand staircase, his tuxedo half unbuttoned, his eyes wild and locked on her like she was the only truth he'd ever known. Her breath caught, her fingers tightening around her son's shoulders. Kai looked up curiously. Zane tilted his head. And then, as the crowd watched in stunned silence, Henrik reached the floor and dropped to his knees in front of the boys. His voice cracked. "Lena, they're mine." Lena didn't answer immediately. Her eyes shimmered, not with fear, but with 5 years of silence, 5 years of raising warriors, 5 years of being the only heartbeat in their home. She nodded once, and that was enough. Henrik's world collapsed and rebuilt itself in the same breath. "I didn't know," he whispered. "God, I didn't know." Tears welled in his eyes as he looked at each boy, at their hair, their expressions, their tiny hands that were both new and familiar. "I missed their first words, their first steps. Lena gently pulled her boys closer, shielding them not from him, but from the weight of his regret. "You missed everything, Henrik. But not because I wanted you to, because your mother made sure you never saw the truth." Gasps rippled again. Sabrina, who had been approaching in haste, stopped in her tracks. The veil of control she wore slipped for a moment too long. People saw. People heard. Henrik turned, his face twisted in disbelief and fury. "Is it true?" he demanded, loud enough for guests to hear. "Did you hide them from me?" Sabrina faltered, her lips parting, but no words came. The truth, finally visible, didn't need her confirmation. It hung between them like a thunderstorm, and in that moment everything that had been constructed, the lies, the shame, the silence, began to crumble. Lena didn't seek applause, she didn't revel in the drama. She stood calmly as Henrik turned back to her, his eyes now pleading, not with anger, but with something deeper. Desperation. "Please," he whispered. "I need to know them. I need to know you. Again." Lena's expression softened, but her voice stayed strong. "You don't get to ask for everything in a moment, Henrik. They're not just an apology. They're not a story to fix your name. They're my life." Henrik bowed his head, humbled by her power, broken by her truth. And in the silence that followed, Kai and Zane simply looked up at the man who now knelt before them, confused but not afraid. And though the storm wasn't over, the first crack of light had broken through the sky. Silence lingered in the aftermath of Henrik's breathless whisper, his body still on his knees. But Lena had already begun to rise. Her hands were steady as they cupped Kai's shoulder and Zane's back, her voice low yet warm as she guided them away from the weight of the moment, her fingers whispering a mother's strength, even while her heart quivered in its cage. She had not come to break anything, yet something shattered inside that wedding hall, the illusion, the performance, the script written by Sabrina's proud hands. As Lena turned to walk forward, the hush behind her morphed into rustling murmurs and sharp inhales, and the ripple she caused moved through velvet seats and satin gowns like the aftershock of truth cracking glass. Every eye followed her movement, drawn not only to her beauty, wrapped in a silky beige gown that hugged her elegance, but to the two little boys flanking her, regal and innocent, as if divinely placed for revelation. Kai's shoes tapped lightly against the marble. Zane's fingers gripped his paper flower again, and together they walked with their mother down the aisle, not toward a man, but through a crowd that had never truly seen her until this moment. Henrik remained still, as though time had frozen around him, his mind collapsing beneath the weight of revelations that no amount of corporate power could deflect. His lips were parted, yet no words emerged. He couldn't breathe, not properly, not with the image of his sons, his actual sons, walking so closely beside the woman he had once loved and abandoned under layers of misunderstanding and influence. He could see himself in their faces, in the slope of their eyebrows, in the delicate arch of their smiles. It was undeniable, inescapable, merciless in its clarity. He felt the ground beneath his feet dissolve as Lena approached, not stopping, not hesitating. She didn't look at him with tears or vengeance, only with a quiet strength that said, "I am whole, with or without you." It broke something deep inside him, not violently, but deeply, like the sound of a heart caving inward after pretending too long that it wasn't bleeding. At the altar, his bride-to-be, dressed in a gown custom-fitted to a dream not her own, stood frozen with her bouquet wilting slightly in her hands. Her eyes darted between Henrik's stunned expression and the woman now approaching with two little boys who clearly didn't belong to anyone else but him. There was confusion in her gaze, hurt threatening to bloom. But more than that, there was fear. She knew, in the way women always seem to know before anyone speaks, that she was witnessing not a love triangle, but the reopening of a soul-bonded wound. She could see it in the way Henrik's eyes were locked on Lena, like a man catching sight of oxygen after 5 years underwater. The bouquet trembled slightly in her grip. The music that once played in the background had long faded, and now the silence bore down like thunder dressed in velvet. Lena did not stop to explain. She owed no one a justification, not even the startled bride who looked at her like an earthquake dressed in grace. She walked past Henrik slowly, her boys beside her, and though every step cracked the ceiling of Sabrina's perfect illusion, she did not tremble. Her walk was slow, purposeful, filled with a grace only earned through years of surviving silence and raising love in secret. When she reached the center aisle, guests began turning their heads, their eyes darting to one another. Some leaned toward each other to whisper hurried speculations. Who were the children? Why was Henrik staring like that? What did this mean for the wedding? But all those questions floated unanswered in the space between Lena and the altar. Even the bride's father, seated in the front row with his hands folded neatly, raised an eyebrow at the shift in energy. He was a businessman himself and could recognize when the foundation of a deal was crumbling in real time. Sabrina, standing near the floral arch with her pearl necklace tight around her throat, could feel the day spiraling from her control. Her painted smile began to twitch, her composure a fragile mask that thinned with every heartbeat. She had designed this moment meticulously, inviting Lena only to humiliate her, to remind her of what she had lost, to parade a new bride in front of the one she deemed inferior years ago. But instead, Lena had arrived not as a wounded shadow, but as the sun itself, pulling all gravity toward her without saying a word. Sabrina's eyes narrowed as her gaze flitted to the children, the perfect symmetry of their features, confirming what she already feared. Her lie, the one she'd told Henrik to sever his bond with Lena, was no longer safe behind her lips. It now lived in the faces of two boys who bore the class and name without ever being told it. Henrik slowly stood, his hands falling limply at his sides, unsure whether to approach, to speak, to cry, or to scream. But Lena did not grant him the moment. She walked past him with her head held high and guided her sons to two empty chairs on the far side of the hall. The eyes of the audience followed her like a dance, breath held tightly in every chest. Once she reached the seats, she calmly helped Kai climb into one and handed Zane a small notebook and crayons, her hands motherly and calm, her heart thundering behind a wall of unshaken resolve. She sat beside them, legs crossed, hands folded in her lap, and only then did she lift her eyes across the hall to meet Henrik's once more. He was still standing where she'd passed him, unmoved, like a monument of disbelief cracked open at the core. The bride, desperate to reclaim attention, cleared her throat, stepping forward slightly, but the crowd's focus refused to shift. Every soul in the room understood instinctively. This was no longer a wedding. This was an awakening. The pianist, unsure whether to resume playing, hovered his hands above the keys and waited for a signal that never came. The silence continued to stretch, long and heavy, until finally one voice in the crowd whispered what everyone was thinking. "Those are his children." And like a gust of wind pushing over dominoes, the truth spilled through the room with invisible force. Sabrina's lips parted, perhaps to protest, but Henrik suddenly turned toward her, eyes burning, not with anger alone, but with betrayal. He had loved and trusted her above all, she who raised him, who guided him in business and life. And now he saw that trust soaked in poison. Lena, from her seat, watched the storm she never wanted unfold. She didn't wish for chaos, didn't crave drama, but she would no longer shrink from it. She had come not to ignite a fire, but to stop hiding in the ashes. She gently rested her hand on Zane's knee, calming his growing restlessness, and then met Henrik's gaze again, this time with something soft beneath her strength. Forgiveness wasn't yet in her eyes, but there was no hatred either. There was only truth. The bride looked at Henrik and whispered, "Is there something you didn't tell me?" He blinked, struggling to form words, but the confession was now written across every muscle in his face, in every vein vibrating with realization. "I didn't know," he murmured. "I didn't know anything until today." And somehow that made it worse. For her, for him, for everyone. Guests began whispering louder now, some standing, some turning to leave. The ceremony had clearly derailed. The minister, holding the vows in shaking hands, stepped back uncertainly, while the wedding photographer lowered his camera, unsure whether this was still a celebration or a headline. Henrik looked around, lost, his grip on reality slipping. The one truth that now screamed louder than all the music, all the speeches, all the wealth, was that he had been living a lie. He glanced back at Lena one more time, her posture straight, her eyes calm, her sons leaning against her shoulders, and in that moment he realized that everything real about his life had been sitting quietly on the edges of the world he built without them. He took a step forward, then another, the sound of his shoes echoing on the marble like an announcement. Everyone turned toward him, wondering what he'd do. But Lena didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already made her entrance. She had already won her battle, not with weapons or vengeance, but with motherhood, grace, and a silence that roared louder than any accusation. Henrik reached her, knelt slowly beside her chair again, not as a CEO, not as a groom, but as a man unmade. He looked up into her face and whispered, "Tell me what to do. I don't know how to fix this, but I know I need to try." And in that suspended moment, the wedding that was supposed to unite two hearts in performance shattered beneath the weight of the one that had already been torn apart years ago, and now was quietly beginning to rebuild. Henrik knelt there on the marble, his soul stripped bare, but the weight of Lena's silence pressed heavier than any words she could have spoken. Her silence wasn't empty. It was thunder in stillness, an answer louder than shouting, and Henrik felt it wrap around him like the cold air of regret rising from a grave he never meant to dig. She didn't have to say the boys were his. The universe already had. The evidence stood in front of him, living and breathing and blinking up at him with eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. Their small faces shimmered with the same quiet fire he remembered from his childhood, their expressions painted with emotions he had buried long ago to please a mother who never really understood what love was. As Zane tugged gently at Lena's dress and whispered for a snack, Henrik's heart cracked even further. How many moments like that had he missed? How many bedtime stories had echoed into silence because he wasn't there to tell them? The wedding hall behind them was collapsing into whispers, sharp heels tapping nervously, champagne glasses half lowered, conversations hushed as heads turned toward the exit, where he had followed Lena like a man chasing his own shadow. But Henrik didn't care. The expensive ceremony, the designer vows, the social climbing guests, all of it turned to smoke the moment he saw his sons. His sons. The word echoed in his chest like an ache that had waited 5 long years to be named. He stood slowly, legs trembling as if waking from a coma, and took a hesitant step toward Lena, who now stood near the carved wooden doors at the edge of the venue, her hand gently resting on Kai's shoulder. He opened his mouth again, voice shaking from within like fragile glass. "Lena," he breathed, Please tell me, are they mine? She didn't flinch. Her face didn't break. But her silence roared even louder the second time, and Henrik's soul knew the answer before his mind allowed it. Lena's eyes held his for one long, breathless second, and then dropped to her boys, as if saying, "This is your answer." Zane turned to Kai and whispered something silly, a child's joke perhaps, and the two boys giggled, a sound so pure, so untouched by the corruption of adult lies, that it pierced Henrik straight through. Then Kai looked up at Henrik, his little hand still clinging to the soft lapel of his blazer, and with the kind of innocent kindness that only children carry, he smiled. "Hi, sir," he said brightly, unaware of the avalanche his words would unleash. It wasn't the greeting that hit Henrik. It was the way the word "sir" echoed like distance. He was their father, yet they called him nothing. Not daddy, not papa, not even stranger. Just "sir." Henrik's legs buckled slightly, and he caught himself on a nearby column, breathing ragged as his mind reeled. He had missed it all. Their births, their first cries, their first laughs, their first scraped knees and bedtime cuddles and birthdays with candles glowing on lopsided cakes. He had missed their entire lives, 5 years of living, of loving, of growing. And all because he had believed a lie told by the woman who now stormed through the wedding hall with venom dripping from every word. Sabrina's heels clicked like thunder as she appeared at the doorway, eyes blazing, her voice sharp enough to slice bone. "How dare you show up here with these children like some cheap soap opera twist?" she spat, ignoring the gasps behind her and pointing a manicured finger at Lena like she was filth. "You've always wanted to ruin this family, haven't you? You've always been nothing but a stain." "Sabrina," Henrik said suddenly, his voice low but deadly quiet. Everyone fell still. The bride had followed a few steps behind Sabrina, her hands trembling as she watched the man she was supposed to marry stand between his past and his future. Henrik didn't look at her. He couldn't. His eyes were fixed on his mother, but this time something was different. His gaze no longer held obedience or fear. It was raw, stripped, and ice-cold. "Did you know?" he asked, the words heavy. "Did you know they were mine?" Sabrina faltered for the first time. Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again, like a fish gasping on land. I only did what was best for you," she stammered, stepping back suddenly less queen and more cornered wolf. She would have ruined you, Henrik. She already was. That woman, she doesn't belong in our world. She never did." Henrik's jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. His voice, when it came again, was a quiet storm. "You knew," he said. "You knew she was pregnant, and you lied. You told me she left me, that she was using me. You stole my family from me." Lena stood still, saying nothing, letting the storm swirl around her as she held her sons close. She had known this confrontation might come, but she didn't want it to be about vengeance. Still, she didn't shield Sabrina from the truth, and she didn't shield Henrik from his pain. This was his truth to carry now. This was his fire to walk through. Henrik stepped away from the column and moved closer to the twins, who now watched everything with wide, curious eyes. Zane tilted his head. "Why is that lady yelling at Mommy?" he asked quietly, and Henrik's heart shattered again. "Because," he said hoarsely, "some people don't know what love looks like." Then he knelt again, this time not to beg Lena, but to meet his sons at eye level. "I don't know your names," he whispered brokenly. "I don't even know what your favorite food is, or your favorite bedtime story. I don't know how many teeth you've lost, or what your laugh sounds like when you watch cartoons. But I know one thing." He swallowed hard, tears fighting to fall. "I love you. I don't even deserve to say it yet. But I do. With everything I am." Kai blinked, a little unsure, and looked to Lena, who gave the smallest nod. It wasn't permission. It was simply trust. Kai stepped forward, curious, and extended a hand toward Henrik. "My name is Kai," he said softly. "That's Zane." Henrik took the tiny hand into his own, and that single moment unraveled 5 years of bitterness, of regret, of manipulation. The warmth of his son's fingers lit a fire in his chest that he didn't know was still alive. He looked up at Lena, and the storm in his eyes had changed. It wasn't rage or confusion anymore. It was grief. Grief for everything he never got to know. For every night she cried alone. For every morning she held both their sons and whispered to them how they were loved, even when the world refused to show it. Sabrina tried again, her voice shaking. "Henrik, I did what I thought." "No," he cut in, his voice steel. "You did what you wanted. You thought you could erase her, erase them. But you erased me in the process." His eyes hardened. "You don't get to speak anymore." The crowd behind them watched in stunned silence. The bride slowly walked backward, her hands letting go of the bouquet at last. It fell to the floor with a soft, symbolic thud. The wedding was over. Whatever fairy tale Sabrina had built on lies had collapsed into dust beneath Lena's quiet strength and the boy's innocent presence. Henrik turned back to Lena, rising from his knees, his voice trembling as he asked again, only this time not with entitlement, but with humility, with a man's genuine need to repair. "Please," he said, "I know I don't deserve anything. But can I talk to you? Not as a CEO, not as the man who left you, just as their father. As someone who finally wants to understand what I destroyed." Lena's eyes searched his, and in them she saw something different than the Henrik who had walked away 5 years ago. She saw ruin, she saw honesty, she saw remorse. But forgiveness was still far. She nodded slowly, then looked at the boys. "Boys," she said softly, "would you like to go talk with your dad?" Zane's eyes widened, and he grinned. "Daddy?" The word hit Henrik like a blessing and a curse all at once. He knelt again, tears finally spilling, and held out his arms. They didn't run to him. Not yet. But they didn't run away either. And that was a beginning. That night, long after the chandeliers dimmed and the last stunned guests left behind whispers on marble floors, Henrik Klassen sat alone in the solitude of his penthouse office, a place once filled with confidence and power, now echoing only with regret. The city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but not even the golden skyline of his empire could distract him from the ruins inside his chest. His tailored suit jacket hung limply off the back of the leather chair, his silk tie discarded across the desk like forgotten armor, and he sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands, as if trying to stop his thoughts from crashing louder than thunder. His eyes were swollen, not from exhaustion, but from the tears he didn't remember allowing. The kind that crept in quietly, born not from weakness, but the sudden eruption of 5 years of willful blindness being torn away in a single day. On the polished mahogany desk sat a single photograph, curled at the edge, faded, and accidentally dropped from Lena's clutch during the storm of emotion outside the wedding hall. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't posed. It was just a soft moment frozen in time. Lena holding two swaddled infants in a modest hospital room, exhaustion in her eyes, but joy too, a kind of radiant light that came only from love earned through pain. Henrik had stared at it for hours now, unable to look away. The babies, his sons, rested in her arms as if they belonged nowhere else. No nurse in sight, no nameplates, just her and the miracle she had carried all alone. He could barely remember how it felt to touch her skin, how her fingers used to trace patterns on his chest when they lay in bed, and she spoke softly about names for future children. He remembered once she'd mentioned Zane because it sounded strong, like a warrior, and Henrik had laughed, teasing her that their future child would end up gentler than them both. He never imagined that moment would become a buried treasure he'd lose by his own hand. Now he knew that the very name he once laughed at belonged to a boy who had grown for 5 years in the shadow of his absence, a boy who had never once felt his father's arms. Hendrik squeezed his eyes shut and cursed beneath his breath. What did I do? He hadn't seen it then. That last fight with Lena had felt like betrayal. Sabrina had carefully orchestrated it, choosing the right time, the perfect angle, and planting the poison slowly, like a gardener tending to a deadly bloom. First, it had been small things, gentle suggestions that Lena wasn't a good match, that she was too quiet, too unfamiliar with high society, too much of a dreamer. Then came the whispers. Do you really know where she goes in the afternoons? You know she asked about your net worth again, right? Henrik had brushed them off at first, trusting Lena's laugh and her warm embraces more than his mother's suspicions. But Sabrina was relentless. One night, just days after Lena had discovered she was pregnant, though she hadn't told him yet, Sabrina arrived at his office with a manila envelope and tears in her voice. I didn't want to show you this, she had said dramatically, but I can't let you be made a fool. Inside were photos, blurred, grainy images of Lena hugging a man outside a bookstore, Henrik's old friend Derek, who had always adored her and who Lena had told Henrik about. The angle made it look intimate, but the truth, as he realized now with a fresh wave of horror, was that the photos were framed to lie. They were staged, manipulated. But at the time, he didn't ask Lena. He didn't let her explain. He had gone home that night, heart burning with betrayal, and accused her, wildly, cruelly, of using him. He remembered how her hands trembled when she reached for his arm. Henrik, please, she had said, her voice cracked. There's something I need to tell you. It's important. But he'd already pulled away. Save it, he had growled. You're not who I thought you were. He had slammed the door on her voice, on the truth, on his own future. Tonight those words rang back with devastating clarity, and he realized that what she'd wanted to say wasn't a defense. It was a beginning. She was going to tell him she was pregnant. Henrik stood up sharply, pacing the office now like a caged animal. The floor, once a symbol of control and success beneath his feet, now felt like it was made of broken glass. Why didn't I ask her? Why didn't I listen? He whispered again and again, running both hands through his thick, now disheveled hair. His beard was unkempt from hours of sitting in place, thinking. Everything he had built, all the wealth, the reputation, the icy pride he wrapped around himself, felt hollow compared to the loss he now carried like chains. He had believed his mother over the woman who had once laid her heart at his feet, and that belief had cost him everything. He dropped into his chair again, pulled open the drawer of his desk, and retrieved a hidden leather-bound journal Lena had once given him during their first year together. The front page still bore her handwriting. For your quiet thoughts, when your mouth can't hold the truth. He hadn't written in it once. It had remained untouched, symbolic of the walls he always kept up. But tonight, that book felt like the only place his guilt could go. He opened to the first empty page and began to write. Not for business, not for show, but raw, crumbling honesty. Lena, he began, if you ever read this, I need you to know. I was blind. I was weak. I let the wrong person define our love, and I walked away when I should have held you. I see it now. I see everything. The ink blurred slightly as his tears fell. He didn't bother wiping them away. Downstairs, the city still pulsed with life, but in Henrik's soul, time had stopped. It was a reckoning. He sat for hours, replaying every scene he had refused to question. How Sabrina had always intercepted Lena's calls after the breakup. How his phone had mysteriously stopped receiving messages from her, how no letters ever arrived. And now he knew why. His mother had stolen them, blocked them, rerouted the pain directly to Lena while convincing Henrik that silence was her guilt. But the real silence was his own, the silence of not fighting for the woman he claimed to love. He picked up his phone and stared at her number. Still saved, still there, untouched for 5 years. His thumb hovered, heart pounding. He didn't press call. Not yet. He needed to earn that moment. Instead, he turned back to the photo on his desk, Lena's tired but glowing face, the boys swaddled in her arms, their tiny faces barely visible under cotton caps, and whispered again, "What did I do?" There was no answer, only silence. But inside that silence was a vow to undo the damage. And one truth had now rooted itself so deep it could never be removed. Lena didn't abandon him. He abandoned her. And now Henrik Klassen, the powerful, respected CEO, knew for the first time what it meant to truly feel weak. Henrik hadn't slept in days. Not truly. He'd spent each night pacing the corners of his luxury penthouse, walking circles into the cold marble like some haunted man chasing the ghost of a past he once ignored. He couldn't rest, not with that photo still burned into the back of his eyes, not with the sound of Kai's innocent "Hi, sir," echoing louder than any business meeting ever had. The sleepless nights were a fitting penance, he told himself, for the years he'd missed, for the truth he'd refused to see, for the love he had walked away from. But this ache was different now. It wasn't shame alone anymore. It was a craving, a deep, gut-twisting desire to know the curve of his son's laughter, to know the routine of Lena's quiet evenings, to feel the weight of a child's body on his lap without it feeling like a stranger. The next morning, before the city could stretch into its usual rush, Henrik drove himself. No driver, no security, to the neighborhood Sabrina once scoffed at. It wasn't grand, it wasn't gated, but the small row houses had flower boxes in the windows, wind chimes dancing with every soft breeze, and bikes leaning against porch rails. It smelled like life, real life, not polished, not perfect, just whole. And there, in the second house from the corner, was the silhouette that had haunted him, Lena, stirring something over the stove while two little figures ran laughing behind her. Through the window he could see her hair tied up in a scarf, her hips swaying slightly to the rhythm of some unplayed tune. She looked tired. She looked alive. He sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart racing faster than the engine. What would he say? Would she slam the door in his face? Would the boys recognize him as more than a stranger with the same smile? He couldn't bring himself to knock. Not yet. Not that day. He drove away, head low, like a coward. But the next day he came again, parked in the same spot. Waited longer, still couldn't move. And again the day after that. It became a ritual, his silent apology. The act of showing up, of not demanding anything, of simply being near. On the fourth morning, his breath caught when he saw movement by the door. It wasn't Lena, it was one of the boys. Kai, in mismatched socks and a superhero t-shirt, pushed the door open wide and stood on the porch, tiny hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun. Henrik's heart nearly exploded from the tenderness of that moment. He stepped out of his car slowly, cautiously, not wanting to spook the boy. Kai tilted his head and smiled with the pure kind of innocence that could melt any man. "Are you our uncle?" the little voice rang out, curious and sweet. Henrik felt the sting behind his eyes before he could speak. He crouched down, leveled himself with the boy's tiny frame, and smiled gently, though it wavered with emotion. "No, I'm someone who wants to know you," he said, voice hoarse, heavy with truth. Before Kai could ask another question, Lena appeared behind him, her presence strong, commanding, not cruel, but fierce in her motherhood. She didn't yell, she didn't shut the door. She simply stood there, arms folded across her chest, eyes hard with protection, and years of unshed tears. Her silence said more than 1,000 words. Yet, when Kai reached back and took her hand, asking, "Can he come in and play superheroes?" Lena hesitated, but nodded once. And just like that, Henrik walked into a life he had only imagined from the outside. The living room smelled like cinnamon and warm fabric. Toys littered the floor, and crayon drawings of dragons and space rockets were taped to the fridge. It wasn't the life of a CEO, but it was beautiful. "Shoes off," Kai instructed proudly. Henrik obeyed. He sank onto the rug, still in his slacks and crisp white shirt, as the boys began handing him plastic masks and cardboard shields. Zane, quieter than his brother, eyed him curiously, then tapped his arm. "You be the villain," he said seriously. Henrik smiled. "I think I've already been that," he murmured under his breath. But he put on the mask. He let them climb on him, defeat him in battle, declare him defeated by super twins, and demand juice boxes in victory. And as the minutes turned into an hour, Lena watched silently from the archway, arms still crossed, but a war brewing behind her eyes. She didn't smile, she didn't interrupt, but she didn't stop it either. When Zane curled up in Henrik's lap and yawned, Henrik felt something inside him shift. A quiet earthquake, the cracking open of something that had long been sealed shut. He wrapped his arm around the boy gently, carefully, as if afraid he might break from the contact. And as Zane's head nestled against his shoulder, a warmth filled Henrik that he had never felt in boardrooms or luxury hotels or gala nights. This was what fatherhood felt like. Not just the title, the weight, the gift. He caught Lena's gaze then, and, though she didn't move, her eyes flickered with something unreadable. Maybe pain, maybe memories, maybe the tiny spark of consideration. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. She was letting him see, letting him feel, letting him earn it. And that was everything. Later, when he stood to leave, brushing crumbs from his slacks and smoothing his shirt, he crouched down once more in front of the boys. "Can I come back?" he asked softly. "Tomorrow?" Kai clapped. "Yes, we need to beat you again." Zane simply nodded. Lena said nothing, but she didn't stop them. As Henrik stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the street quieter. The weight in his chest, though still heavy, now had hope threaded through it. And for the first time in 5 years, he smiled. Not the public smile he wore for cameras or clients, but a real one. A father's smile. He had missed everything, but he was here now, and he would never, ever leave again. The next few days unfolded with an almost fragile peace, the kind that hangs in the air like early morning fog, soft but filled with tension beneath its quiet surface. Henrik became a regular presence in Lena's home, always gentle, always respectful, never overstepping. He didn't ask for forgiveness yet, knowing it wasn't his to demand. Instead, he focused on learning the rhythm of his sons' lives, the way Zane liked his apples sliced, how Kai needed his superhero cape folded just right before bedtime, and how both boys instinctively leaned into Lena like she was the center of their universe. Henrik never interfered. He simply offered help where he could, carrying groceries, picking up toys, sharing small smiles with Lena across the kitchen, while the boys argued over who got the red cup. There were no grand gestures, just small consistencies. One morning, as light poured through the kitchen windows and the smell of buttered toast filled the room, Zane sat on Henrik's lap munching a banana, his curls a soft mess from sleep. Lena poured juice for Kai while humming softly, the scene delicate, almost like a dream. Then Zane looked up innocently, blinking his big brown eyes, and asked in the way only children could, "Mommy, is that the same grandma who said you should go far away and not come back?" The words landed with a thud so sharp it seemed to break something invisible in the air. Lena's hand froze mid-pour, juice spilling slightly onto the counter. Her face paled. Henrik's body went rigid, the spoon in his hand dropping onto the table with a metallic clatter. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. Kai stopped mid-bite. Lena recovered first, quickly distracting the boys, guiding them toward the living room with a forced smile and a calm voice that didn't match the sudden storm in her eyes. Henrik remained seated, staring into the empty space before him, Zane's words echoing in his skull like a hammer. Go far away and not come back. It was no longer just suspicion, no longer just guilt twisted with hope. It was confirmation. Concrete. Final. That night, Henrik drove to the estate. Alone. No driver, no ceremony, just fury barely masked beneath his quiet, determined exterior. The house looked the same, white marble steps, perfectly trimmed hedges, and cold chandeliers that had watched decades of pride parade through their halls. But something was different now. Henrik wasn't the same man who once walked these stairs believing every word his mother whispered. When Sabrina opened the door, she wore her usual polished expression, pearls at her throat, a silk scarf draped like royalty, a glass of wine in hand. "Darling, I heard you've been playing house with the—" she began, but stopped short when she saw his eyes. No warmth, no smile, just cold clarity. "Sit," he said simply, and for the first time in her adult life, Sabrina obeyed her son without question. In the drawing room, he laid it all out, the hidden letters, the twisted stories, the photos she once planted. And then he played the recording, the one his assistant had accidentally uncovered, a call between Sabrina and a private investigator she hired to dig for dirt on Lena. There was no dirt, only lies. "You lied to me," Henrik said, voice trembling, his fists clenched. "You showed me forged photos. You manipulated my mind. You told me she cheated, that she used me, that she left by choice. But she didn't leave, Mom. You forced her to disappear." Sabrina's mouth opened and closed, no defense forming. Her once regal presence seemed to shrink as the truth cornered her. "You destroyed my family," he continued, stepping closer. "You made me miss the birth of my sons. You let me believe she was poison, while you were the one serving it in silver cups." Sabrina's hands shook slightly, her wineglass rattling on the table. "I was protecting you," she whispered, but even she didn't believe it. "From what?" he snapped. "Love? Responsibility? A woman who didn't fit your idea of worth because her skin didn't match your pearls, because she came from warmth instead of wealth." The walls didn't shake, but something did. The illusion, the power she held over him, the pedestal she once stood on crumbled. "She was never the problem," Henrik said firmly, eyes burning. "You were." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sabrina sitting in the silence of her unraveling kingdom. That night, he didn't go to the penthouse. He didn't go to a hotel. He drove to the only place that felt like redemption, Lena's doorstep. When she opened the door, her face unreadable, but eyes swollen from earlier tears. Henrik didn't speak at first. He stood beneath the porch light, breathing hard, unsure of what he was even allowed to say. "She ruined everything," he finally whispered. "But I won't let her anymore." Lena studied him for a long moment, her lips parted, but words caught in her throat. Then she did something that broke him. She reached up and wiped the tear that had escaped down his cheek. A silent act, a small grace. She didn't welcome him in that night, but she didn't close the door either. Behind her, the soft sound of cartoons played as the boys giggled, and for the first time Henrik felt that maybe, just maybe, he'd begun to earn the right to stand on that porch, not as a guest, not as an intruder, but as a man willing to rebuild what he once helped break. Sabrina's reign had ended, and for Lena the shadows were finally starting to lift. The days that followed the confrontation with Sabrina unfolded like fragments of glass, slowly sliding into their rightful places, not perfectly smooth, but no longer sharp enough to bleed. Henrik didn't speak of the second wedding publicly. He simply let the news unravel on its own, like thread from an unraveling tapestry, no longer worthy of mending. The world whispered, reporters lurked, and Sabrina fell silent, her voice removed from Henrik's life like a once glorious chandelier that now lay in pieces on the floor. But despite the whirlwind, Henrik moved with an unfamiliar stillness, a clarity he had never known even during his years building empires. He spent his mornings with Kai and Zane, letting them smear jam on his tailored shirts, letting them teach him how to be someone he'd never dared to be. A father, messy and warm, and wonderfully lost in the world of paper airplanes and bedtime stories. Lena didn't speak much. She watched. She listened. Her silence became his compass. He didn't ask to sleep in her home, didn't press for answers. He simply showed up, consistently, gently, learning how to rebuild without demanding, to restore. Then came the day the postponed wedding was rescheduled. The bride, a model wrapped in socialite privilege and practiced smiles, tried to pretend she still wanted it. But everyone knew the show was ending. Henrik stood once again at the altar in the lavish hall Sabrina had booked. This time, not as a puppet, not as a blind heir fulfilling an empty role, but as a man shackled by the weight of past cowardice and the fire of a newfound truth. The chandeliers above still glittered, the orchestra still played, and the crowd, dressed in pearls and polish, watched from velvet seats, eager for a love story that wasn't real. Lena sat near the back, tucked in a quiet row with her boys beside her, dressed in simple elegance. She wasn't there to witness anything but closure. Henrik's back was straight, jaw tense, heart heavy as the music shifted, signaling the bride's entrance. But with every step the woman in white took toward him, his chest felt tighter, heavier, like a dam cracking. The priest cleared his throat, voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Henrik Klassen, do you take—" But he never finished. Henrik stepped back. The crowd gasped as he turned, eyes scanning the rows until they locked onto a familiar figure, dressed in deep sapphire, her boys seated at either side, their innocence shielding her like a divine armor. "I can't do this," Henrik said, voice low but resolute. The whispers were immediate, like rustling paper caught in wind, but he didn't stop. "I can't marry someone who doesn't know the real me, who doesn't know I already have a family, and they're not standing up here." The bride froze mid-aisle, her bouquet trembling. Sabrina, seated beside influential names, turned a deathly pale. But Henrik was already walking, down the marble aisle, past stunned faces, past expectations and etiquette and everything he once bowed to. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He walked with a calm that only truth could grant. And when he reached the row where Lena sat, her breath caught, her posture stiffening not from fear, but disbelief. He stood in front of her. The world behind him vanished. Slowly he dropped to his knees, not for the cameras, not for the spectacle, but for the first time as a man stripped of pride, kneeling in surrender to the woman he once let go. "Lena," he began, voice trembling, "I made the greatest mistake of my life the day I let you walk away, but the deeper sin was never coming back, and missing 5 years of your strength, your kindness, your love." He reached for her hand, not forcefully, but like someone asking to touch sacred ground. His fingers barely brushed hers. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. But I will spend every breath I have earning the right to be near you, to be in our sons' lives, to prove that love isn't always perfect, but it can be reborn." The hall was silent. Even the children had stopped, whispering. Zane looked up at his mother with wide eyes, while Kai clutched her shawl with a soft whisper of, "Is he crying, Mommy?" And he was. Tears rolled down Henrik's cheeks, not theatrical, not performative, but raw. "I'm not asking you to forget," Henrik whispered. "I'm asking for a chance to remember, together, a new memory, a real one, with no lies, no barriers, no one standing between us but love." Lena's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes glistened with unshed emotion, not anger, not even pain, but the kind of ache that comes from hearing what you once waited years to hear, and then wondering if your heart was strong enough to let it in. She didn't pull her hand away. She didn't lean forward either. Her silence wasn't rejection, it was reflection, a storm of love and loss, hope and caution. But to Henrik, that silence was everything. It wasn't a closed door, it was a crack in the wall, a doorway waiting to be stepped through. A beat passed, then another. The bride walked out without a word. Sabrina remained frozen in her seat, humiliated and defeated. The guests didn't know where to look, some ashamed, others enthralled. But none of that mattered anymore, because Henrik, still kneeling, still holding Lena's hand, had chosen to rewrite his story, not with grand weddings or headlines, but with a single sentence spoken from the heart. "Let me love you again." Not perfectly, but honestly. Lena didn't answer with words. She gently reached forward and wiped a tear from his cheek, the same way she had on that porch the night he returned broken. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was possibility. And for the first time in 5 years, the past stopped chasing them. The moment held its breath. The world waited. And two little boys, holding each other's hands, whispered at the same time, "Maybe Daddy is staying." Henrik smiled through his tears. Because maybe, just maybe, they were right. The moment Lena gently wiped the tear from Henrik's cheek in the wedding hall, she didn't realize that her touch had unlocked something deeper in both of them, a quiet agreement between wounded souls that healing would no longer be postponed, that silence would no longer be punishment, and that love, though bruised and cracked, still whispered beneath the rubble. She didn't speak as he rose slowly from his knees that day, and she didn't stop him as he quietly walked out of the hall without another word. But her eyes followed him with something unspoken, a tether, invisible and ancient, still holding strong. That night the boys were unusually quiet, sensing something had shifted in the rhythm of their home. Lena tucked them in with a lingering kiss on each forehead, the way she had done every night since their first breath. But her heart beat differently, like it was knocking against the walls of her chest, remembering how it once danced to a rhythm only Henrik could play. But she didn't open the door to him that night, even though he never knocked. She watched from behind her curtains as he stood by the sidewalk under the streetlight for nearly 20 minutes, just looking at the home that now belonged to her and their children. He didn't move, didn't beg, didn't even try to make her come out. He simply stood there like someone waiting to be worthy. And for the next day, and the one after that, and every evening that followed, Henrik returned, never demanding, never forcing, just showing up with small kindnesses that meant more than any apology could. He brought the boys puzzles and books, not flashy gifts, but thoughtful ones, things a father would know his sons liked if he paid attention. He learned how Zane liked his toast, slightly burnt, and how Kai always needed to be told a made-up story before bed, or he wouldn't sleep. He stood outside in the rain one evening when he arrived late, and the boys had already gone to bed, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets, his eyes on the soft light that glowed through the living room curtains. He never called. He never texted. He waited. And each time Lena felt a strange ache in her chest, not pain, but recognition, like a melody she hadn't heard in years was softly playing again. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about presence. It was about showing up, not just for love, but for the life that love had created. On the seventh day, it rained harder than usual. Lena didn't expect him to come, assuming even he would take shelter tonight. But just after dinner, as the thunder rumbled low, she heard a soft knock. Not at the front door, but on the wooden side gate. When she opened it, her breath caught. Henrik was curled slightly on the porch swing, soaked fast asleep, a tiny flashlight clipped to the collar of his shirt, and an open children's book lying across his lap, the very one she had seen him read to the boys a few days before. His legs were tucked up like a boy who had grown old without ever learning how to ask for warmth. His lips were slightly parted, his lashes wet from rain or tears or both. And in that moment, something broke inside her, not from sadness but from recognition. She had loved this man once. No, not once. She had never stopped. She had just buried it so deep that she forgot how much light it still held. She stepped closer without waking him, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the wool blanket from the chair and draped it carefully over him. The second the warmth touched his body, he stirred, his eyes fluttering open slowly, confusion melting into hope as he looked up and saw her kneeling beside him. "Lena," he whispered, voice hoarse, barely more than breath. She nodded softly, brushing the wet strands of hair from his forehead. "You'll catch a cold like this," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Why do you keep doing this?" His lips curved into a tired smile. "Because if I can't be in your heart yet, I'll wait outside it every night until you open the door, even if it takes the rest of my life." His words weren't poetry. They were vows in disguise, raw and soaked with sincerity. She looked at him long, and for the first time she didn't hold back the tears. They rolled freely, mixing with the rain still dripping from the roof above them. She cupped his face, and this time her hand didn't pull away. "You still love me?" he asked, the question trembling on his tongue like something too sacred to voice. Her thumb grazed his cheekbone, her voice steady despite the storm within her. "I never stopped," she whispered. "Even when I hated you, even when I wished I hadn't, I loved you through every tear and every night I cried alone. But I didn't know if I could ever trust you again." He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't blame Sabrina, didn't point to the lies. He simply nodded, accepting her truth like it was scripture. "You don't have to trust me yet," he said, voice breaking. "Just let me be near. Let me try." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his for a moment, the rain a gentle lullaby around them. "Stay tonight," she said quietly. "On the couch. Just so the boys know you didn't leave again." His eyes filled with gratitude, with the kind of emotion that no empire, no fortune, no apology could ever capture. "Anything you want," he breathed. "Even if you tell me to sleep outside forever, I'll be here." But that night, she left the door unlocked, and as he lay on the couch with the boys giggling as they tucked him under a blanket, and Lena stood in the hallway watching them with a hand pressed to her chest, she felt something shift, not backward, not forward, but inward. A part of her that had stayed hidden for 5 long years finally whispered, "Maybe it's safe to breathe again." And the wound that had defined so much of her life didn't just hurt less, it began to heal. Because love had returned, not demanding, not grandiose, but in its truest, quietest form, showing up every day, even in the rain, even in silence, even when forgiveness wasn't promised. The morning sunlight poured through the kitchen window like a gentle embrace, bathing the hardwood floors in a soft golden hue as the scent of warm pancakes filled the air, mingling with the quiet laughter of 2 boys whose world had finally begun to make sense again. Henrich, holding a grocery bag in one hand and a bouquet of fresh yellow lilies in the other, stepped inside as he did every morning now. Not like a guest, not like a stranger, but like a man who belonged, a man whose heart had finally found its true home. Before he could say a word, a tiny pair of feet thundered across the room, and Kai launched himself into his arms with a cry so full of innocence and joy it nearly split Henrik's chest wide open. "Daddy!" Kai's voice rang like bells, unfiltered, pure, and without hesitation. It was the first time he'd used that word, the first time he'd claimed Henrik not as a visitor, not as a maybe, but as his father. Henrik caught him mid-air, dropping the flowers in surprise, his arms instinctively holding his son close as the sound of that one word echoed again and again in his mind like a sacred chant, like a prayer finally answered after years of silence. He squeezed Kai tightly, pressing a kiss to the boy's temple as tears welled up in his eyes, too overcome to speak. Zane stood nearby, a quiet smile blooming across his face as he held something behind his back. "I made this for you," he said shyly, stepping forward and pulling out a folded piece of paper that had been carefully colored and creased at the edges from being held so many times. Henrik unfolded it slowly, and his breath caught as he saw a hand-drawn family portrait. Two little boys in matching red shirts, Lena in a flowing purple dress with her long braids down, and Henrik, tall with his beard and a wide smile, his arms stretched protectively around them all. Over the top, in uneven but determined letters, were the words, "My family." He looked up at Zane with trembling hands, and the boy's smile grew as Henrik pulled him into a hug, holding both boys at once, burying his face in their soft hair. Lena stood quietly by the kitchen counter, watching the scene unfold, her heart rising to her throat. She had loved him once, had trusted him once, and lost everything. But now, with every passing day, she saw not the CEO who had abandoned her, but the man who woke early to help with school lunches, who remembered which nightlight each twin preferred, who listened more than he spoke, and proved his change not with promises, but presence. He didn't just show up, he stayed. And each time he brought something new, books about planets for Kai, a model train for Zane, or her favorite herbal tea, which he'd somehow remembered from years ago. He wasn't just trying to win her over. He was rebuilding what had once been crushed under the weight of betrayal. One afternoon, she came home to find Henrik painting a small fence around the backyard garden, his sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his forehead, and both boys helping with paintbrushes too big for their little hands. She didn't say a word, only watched as he laughed when Zane accidentally painted his shoes, or when Kai insisted the fence needed glitter. Later that evening, she opened a letter from the county office. Henrik had quietly sold one of his city properties and used the funds to start a foundation in the twins' names. The Kai and Zane Foundation for Little Stars. It would offer scholarships, supplies, and meals to underprivileged children across the city. When she asked him why, he simply replied, "Because no child should grow up without someone believing in them. I failed once. I won't fail again." That night, the boys fell asleep between them on the couch, the television still playing a low lullaby of cartoon voices, and Henrik tucked a blanket over them all, his hand brushing hers gently as he whispered, "They're my light now, but you've always been my home." Lena looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the man she had known, not the man she had feared, but the man she had always hoped he could become. Her heart, once guarded like a fortress, now softened like petals opening to the sun. Days passed, filled with ordinary beauty, bike rides in the park, bedtime giggles, rainy afternoons filled with pillow forts, and through it all their love, though fragile, bloomed again, more grounded than ever before. Then, one evening beneath a sky painted with stars, as the boys dozed off in their shared bed, Henrik stood on the little balcony outside Lena's room, holding something small and glinting in his palm. She joined him quietly, and he didn't drop to his knees in desperation. He did it with reverence, with certainty, with love carved deep into his bones. "This time," he began, his voice a soft breeze against the night air. No stage, no cameras, no pressure, just us, just this moment. Will you marry me again, not to fix what we lost, but to build something new? Lena didn't cry out. She didn't tremble. She looked into his eyes, saw the reflection of every hard day and every hopeful one that had passed, and knew her answer had been resting quietly inside her heart for days now. Yes, she whispered, not because she was swept up in emotion, but because she was grounded in it, because she had watched him earn it, piece by painful piece. They kissed under the stars as the twins' quiet snores drifted through the open window, and the universe seemed to hold its breath around them, not to celebrate perfection, but to honor forgiveness. Their broken pieces didn't magically disappear, but now they fit together in a way they never had before, honestly, openly, and beautifully. The morning sun filtered gently through sheer curtains as Lena stood before a mirror, not to question her reflection, but to honor it. The woman looking back at her no longer burdened by the weight of abandonment, but shining with a calm strength only time and love could sculpt. Her dress was simple yet elegant, ivory silk that flowed like liquid light, hugging her figure in all the places her story had carved with scars and resilience, and woven into the hem were tiny embroidered stars, a nod to her sons who had become her guiding constellations when darkness swallowed her world. She took a deep breath, not from nerves, but reverence. For this day was not about spectacle, it was about sacredness, about a love resurrected not with fanfare, but with firelight, forged through pain and made stronger through choice. In the living room of the small venue, a quaint chapel framed with climbing jasmine and old oak benches, Henrik adjusted Zane's little bow tie as the boy giggled and spun in his polished shoes, while Kai practiced walking slowly with the satin pillow, holding the rings, the same way he'd rehearsed the night before, whispering, "I won't drop them, Daddy. Promise." And Henrik knelt before them both, straightening Kai's collar, kissing their foreheads, whispering, "You two are my forever," before rising, heart thunderous not from fear but from awe. When the doors opened and the music began, soft piano chords gently threading the air, every guest turned toward the aisle, but it wasn't just a bride that stepped forward. It was a woman who had survived betrayal, raised two miracles on her own, and still had the courage to love again. Lena's footsteps were light, but her presence was monumental, and at the end of the aisle Henrik's eyes shimmered, not with regret, but gratitude so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. He saw not just the woman he loved, but the life he almost lost, the home he had once abandoned, and the future he now held as his greatest treasure. As she reached him, he gently took her hand, lifted it to his lips, and kissed it like a vow before the vows, then whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on life even when I gave up on you," and her eyes filled with quiet tears that spoke more than words ever could. The ceremony began, not with grand speeches, but with honest ones. The officiant spoke not of perfect unions, but of imperfect hearts choosing each other again and again, despite the bruises of the past. When the time came for the rings, Kai and Zane walked up proudly, holding the pillow like they were carrying the sun itself, their steps slow, careful, and filled with purpose. As Lena knelt to accept the rings from them, she looked into their eyes and said, "You made me brave again." And they both beamed, unaware they had already become the soul of this love story. Sabrina was not present. Her absence was not tragic. It was necessary, a final punctuation to a chapter long closed, her power over them extinguished not by confrontation, but by healing. The vows were whispered with hands tightly clasped, eyes locked, and hearts exposed. Henrik spoke first, his voice steady but reverent. "I vow to never let silence steal us again. I vow to choose you every day, no matter how ordinary or extraordinary the world becomes. and I vow to love our sons not just as their father, but as the man who gets to witness them grow, because you gave them everything when I gave nothing." Lena, voice trembling like soft chimes in the wind, replied, "I vow to trust you, not because you're perfect, but because you chose to grow. I vow to laugh with you in sunshine, cry with you in storms, and walk beside you when the road feels like fire. And I vow to love you, not as the man you were, but as the man you've become, the man who stayed." As the officiant pronounced them husband and wife once more, Henrik didn't wait for permission. He pulled her into a kiss filled with years of longing, apology, hope, and promise. And somewhere behind them, two little voices cheered, "Mommy and Daddy are kissing," followed by giggles and claps that turned the air into joy itself. The guests erupted in gentle applause, but the moment remained intimate, tender, unshaken by performance. This wasn't for them. This was for a woman who was once broken, a man who was once blind, and two little boys who had unknowingly tethered two hearts back together. The reception was less a party and more a communion of souls, a backyard transformed into a glowing wonderland of fairy lights, laughter, and gentle music. Zane danced on Henrik's shoes, giggling as his father spun him around, while Kai showed Lena a clumsy but adorable magic trick with a disappearing cookie. They cut the cake together, the boys smearing icing on each other's cheeks as Lena leaned into Henrik's chest, whispering, "This is everything." And it was. Later they sat beneath the stars again, the same balcony where he once proposed, now their favorite place of peace. Henrik placed a hand on her growing sketchbook. Lena had started drawing again, something she hadn't done in years, and in those pages were glimpses of their future: parks, pillow fights, bedtime stories, and a home built on love, not control. "I never imagined a second wedding could be more beautiful than the first," he murmured. "Because the second one is real," she whispered back, head resting against his shoulder. "The first one was a promise. This one is a truth." And as the night carried them forward, wrapped in warmth and wonder, Henry tucked both boys in bed, reading their favorite superhero story for the 100th time, and before turning off the light, he whispered, "You saved me. Both of you." Lena watched from the doorway, her heart full, her soul no longer fractured. Their story had once been written in pain, stained by lies, silenced by betrayal, but now every chapter going forward would be written in light. Forgiveness had become the ink. Love had become the pen. And this time nothing, not fear, not pride, not even time, could steal the ending they had finally earned. The world had once mocked their fall, but now it stood silent before their rise. Because when truth walks back into the room, when forgiveness finds the strength to hold hands with love, and when destiny finally finds its way home, what was once shattered becomes the most breathtaking mosaic of all. Beautiful, not in spite of the cracks, but because of them.